Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Hannay. I'm the policy analyst for the National Farmers Union, and I am very glad to welcome you to this very special webinar and panel on food price inflation, farmer livelihood, and the declining farmer share of food prices. I want to begin this webinar by acknowledging the land I'm located on and the indigenous peoples and nations of this land. Right now, I look outside my window and see the Deshkan-Zibi, the Anishinaabe-Moan name for the Antler River, or what many now call the Thames River. I live on the London Township Treaty lands, traditional territories of the Chononton, Anishinaabewaki, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples. I am also connected to the lands of the nations of the Chippewas of the Thames, Oneida, and Munsee, Delaware by the Deshkan-Zibi. The NFU acknowledges the long, vibrant history of Indigenous peoples on these lands. We also acknowledge the treaties have not been fulfilled in either letter or in spirit. As people living on and producing food from this land, we acknowledge the need for equitable access. We acknowledge that many settlers, both rural and urban, have received important benefits from the colonial dispossession of indigenous lands. And we acknowledge that all our relations with land and people have been harmed by this ongoing regime. We consider how we can better treat each other, pursue justice, and fulfill the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As I mentioned earlier, and to those who are just joining, this panel is on food price inflation, declining farmer share of food prices, and farmer economic well-being, motivated by the food price inflation that Canadians continue to face in retail grocery stores. The NFU has completed research on the history of farmers' share of food prices, including time series data going back at least 30 years to understand how farm gate prices and retail prices have been changed, including during the current inflationary period. The short of it is that Canadian farmers have seen little or no benefit from increasing retail prices in Canada and face a dangerous cost price squeeze that continues to push farmers out of their livelihoods. I hope to convey to you at least a basic understanding of the economic landscape that farmers face, as well as the causes and effects of food price inflation. And I am glad to have Keldon Bester of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, Alyssa Gerhardt from Dalhousie University, and Alex Purdye on a panel to help me elaborate on this. This panel and research is supported by the Maison Foundation. Maison is a grassroots community foundation that feeds both Jewish and non-Jewish Canadians in need by supporting frontline food projects across the country. Their partners include food banks, school nutrition programs, hot meals and shelters, community garden projects, and also now includes organizations like the NFU that are doing policy research and advocacy on policy solutions to create positive change in the Canadian food system. Each year, their small team works alongside a group of dedicated volunteers to provide hundreds of grants to partner programs, helping them to purchase food, fridges, freezers, and garden supplies to strengthen their programs and feed their communities. This work that the NFU has done could not have been completed without the support of the foundation, as well as Izzy Waxman and Grant Goodman at the Maison Foundation, who have been very supportive of the NFU's work. And just briefly, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, the NFU is a grassroots membership organization advocating for sustainable farms, farmer economic dignity, and a just food system. Our members farm and work on farms all across Canada, producing a wide range of crops and livestock using diverse production methods. If you are not yet a member, we invite you to join. If you farm, you can join as a voting member, and non-farmers can become associate members. To do that, just go to www.nfu.ca. Sarah has posted a link in the chat for that. So this afternoon, I will present some of the NFU's forthcoming research on farmer economic livelihood and the farmer's share of retail food prices for about 20 minutes. And then I'll welcome the rest of the panel to speak about their related research on food price inflation and the farmer's share of food prices for around 40 minutes. And then finally, we will have 30 minutes or so for question and answer with the panel before we wrap up the event. I would also like to mention that we will be recording and posting this presentation and the panel section of the event on our website and YouTube page, but we will not be including the question and answer as part of that posted recording. I would like to ask you to please keep any questions or chat reactions until the question and answer section, as it can be distracting to both presenters and viewers. If you have a technical problem, however, or need to contact me or our technical support, which is Sarah Marquis, during the presentation, please use the chat function for that purpose only. And I'd like to thank our behind-the-scenes team who make this webinar happen, particularly to our NFU outreach strategist, Sarah Marquis, who's done a huge amount of work publicizing this event and many other NFU events and to help get the word out. This presentation provides a bit of a teaser to some new NFU research completed with the support of the Maison Foundation coming in report form soon. We completed research on the history of farmers' share of retail food prices, including time series data compilation going back 30 years to understand how farm gate prices and retail prices have changed. The NFU thought this was meaningful research to complete because a number of commentators have talked about food price inflation as having a number of contributing factors, including increased input prices for retailers, processors, and farmers. NFU farmer members and staff have seen the debate about consumer reaction to food price inflation and have noticed a lack of discussion about how farmers are being affected. Our research demonstrates that the farmers' share of retail food prices in Canada has been decreasing and continues to do so. We conclude that Canadian farmers have not been able to pass on increasing input costs, nor have they seen any benefit from increased retail grocery prices. We also argue that food price inflation and chronically low farm gate prices for farmers have a common cause: massive corporate power shifting costs to consumers and producers while extracting greater amounts of value and money from them. To begin my piece of this afternoon's webinar, I want to foreground the NFU's work and research with this graph. The graph on this slide shows gross farm revenue and net farm income for the last 90 years, including projections to 2025. The area below the black line in orange and yellow represents gross farm revenue, which is projected to be around 90 billion in 2025, and everything below the gray line in yellow and sometimes in red is net farm income. You will notice that net farm income is projected to be less than 10 billion in 2025 and was actually negative in the mid to late 2000s. This shows that the margins that Canadian farmers face are razor thin. Part of this has to do with the low prices that farmers receive, but is also due to rising input costs. And I also want to be clear that net farm income does not capture a number of important things, including family labor, as well as land acquisitions. This graph shows net farm income per acre, which has decreased to about $50 per acre in 2024 and 2025. This graph is important for bringing some nuance into the conversation about net farm income. Looking at the net farm income graphs, particularly this per acre graph, you could ask yourself, how are farmers making a go of it at all? Or you might say, well, I know a number of farmers who are doing very well for themselves. And this is true. Some farmers are doing well for themselves, but those farmers are making up for low per acre income with high volumes of farmland. You can still make $2 million a year farming 40,000 acres at $50 an acre. And this is often what is happening, and the Statistics Canada data shows the decreasing number of farmers with a corresponding increase in farm size. Highly capitalized farms are able to acquire land to cope with decreasing margins, meaning that economies of scale are working. This graph demonstrates another measure of how farmers are doing. This compares gross farm revenue and net income, still in orange and yellow, but with outstanding farm debt, which is the blue line above. Outstanding farm debt eclipsed 145 billion real Canadian dollars last year. These are fairly stark indicators of farmer economic performance, but net income is not a perfect measure. Net farm income can be manipulated and generally benefits larger farms. This stems from access and ability to pay for good accounting services, benefits from subsidized crop insurance, and tax rules that allow charging very rapid depreciation on equipment, as well as market economies of scale and better deals from suppliers and marketers for larger and more frequent input purchases and product sales. And while this critique is valid, net farm income is still an important measure when we talk about farmer economic well-being. While there are many ways for large farms to manipulate their net income, it still demonstrates razor-thin margins for the majority of other farmers who are struggling with their livelihood and the reasoning behind the loss of Canadian farmers. But this is why understanding the farmer share is also important. A farmer's net income generally is the price received for their products minus costs, and so it is important for both consumers and farmers to see how farm gate prices compare to the price food is being sold at retail. The NFU's forthcoming work on the farmer share continues 60 years of research in Canada on the farmer share of retail food prices, whether or not the share is fair, explaining its decline, and contextualizing what that means for the Canadian food system. Our research demonstrates that many Canadian farmers are not receiving fair prices for their products, while consumers are paying more money for food at retail. And I think this is the important contribution of this research, drawing connections between the farmer and consumer as being affected by similar causes, but meaningfully advocating for the Canadian farmer's economic success, as we believe that the farmer's perspective has been mostly absent from debate about the causes and effects of food price inflation in Canada. Through this research, we also wanted to demonstrate the success of supply management in Canada, providing comparisons between supply managed products and non-supply managed products to show how non-market production systems are performing in Canada. And before I present more of our data on the farmer share, I wanted to note that all of our data has been gathered from Statistics Canada, historical reporting from Agriculture Canada, trade reports, or regional price reporting from places like grain and corn elevators. Our data is always presented in real Canadian dollars, adjusted for inflation with base year 2012. And I'll note finally that you will often see two different data sets for retail food prices, and this is because Statistics Canada switched to a new data aggregation process with different methodologies that discontinues old data sets and generally represents an issue with data collection and public availability of data on food prices and product prices generally, where I am very envious of the system that the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, has for communicating industry costs and the farmer's share. The first price graph I would like to share with you shows the retail and farm gate price of milk. Milk is a supply managed product, and for those of you who don't know how supply management works, it governs the production of dairy, eggs, poultry, chicken, and turkey in Canada. Supply management relies on three pillars: cost of production pricing, meaning that supply management guarantees farmers receive prices that cover their production costs; production discipline in the form of allocated quota; and import controls to protect Canadian producers. This graph demonstrates the movement of the price that producers in Ontario and Quebec receive for 1 liter of milk at the farm gate and the retail price of 1 liter of milk for the consumer. Importantly, you'll notice that producer price has not changed substantially since 1995, and this is by design. Cost of production pricing ensures that farm gate prices for supply managed products cover costs for farmers, ensuring stable prices and adequate compensation for farmer labor. You'll also notice that consumer pricing has been relatively stable as well, with prices only increasing by about 1 real Canadian dollar over the last 30 years. The farmer's share of the retail price of milk has decreased, but is at 30% or above, which is good compared to non-supply managed products, as you will see soon. The other supply managed product I'll tease from our report is eggs, which I wanted to show because of the extreme inflation of egg prices in the United States. Farmers' share of the price of eggs is much higher than for many other products, partially because of the lack of processing needed for eggs, but also because of the supply management system ensuring massive egg laying operations aren't driving down prices to unsustainably low levels. The Canadian egg industry is more resilient for having more producers. Geographic concentration and concentration in the number of producers in the United States has allowed for the rapid spread of the new strain of avian flu that has resulted in tens of millions of culled laying hens, leading to astronomically high egg prices in the United States. We now shift into some non-supply managed products, starting with wheat and bread. This graph demonstrates the Western Canadian elevator price for a bushel of wheat and the retail price of loaves of bread going back to 1965. A bushel of wheat is about equal to 45 loaves of bread, and we've compared the difference between the farmer's price of a bushel of wheat and the sum of the price of 45 loaves of bread at retail. The farmer's share of the retail price of bread is less than 10%. Bread is a particularly interesting consumer staple to examine the price movement of, given the bread fixing scandal that involved most major retail grocers in Canada, as well as Canada Bread, but it is not an outlier in the disparity between farm gate and consumer prices. And it is not an outlier because the farmer's share of the retail price of cornflakes cereal, which was derived from corn, is at about the same level of the farmer's share as the retail price of bread. This graph demonstrates that. This is the elevator price of a kilogram of corn from corn elevators in Chatham, Ontario. The farmer's share of 1 kilogram of cornflakes is less than 10%. While processing is involved in transforming corn into cornflakes, farmers still see a flatlining of corn prices while consumers see increasing prices at retail. I wanted to include this graph on frozen potatoes because I recently read a very interesting CBC article about a cartel conspiring to increase the price of frozen potatoes involving Canadian companies McCain and Cavendish, where the filed lawsuit against the involved companies allege that matching price increases between brands began occurring in 2021. This graph shows the price movements of a kilogram of frozen French fries at retail and the price of 1 kilogram of potatoes. Processors gave an extra 20 cents per kilogram to farmers, a corresponding move which apparently required processors and retailers to charge an extra $2 per kilogram to consumers. We could also look at livestock and meat prices as another example. Here I have a graph of the retail price of ground beef in dollars per pound and the Alberta average farm gate price of cull cows live weight in dollars per pound. This is a great place to note the difference between the two StatsCan data sets and some of the methodological differences that have come with the new data set. Beef processing in Canada is particularly interesting as 95% of beef packing capacity in the country is owned by two foreign companies, Cargill and JBS, and their profit margins are fairly good. Recently, an NFU board member from Alberta used the phrase "the long loin pays for the beef" to describe how profitable JBS and Cargill are, and I can only assume this means that Cargill and JBS can easily cover costs with the sale of just one cut of beef, while the rest of the cow is profit for them. You will also notice an upward trend in farm gate prices, and some farmers may argue with me and say that beef prices are better than ever, and well, better than the last few years at least, and are continuing to go up. My response to that would be that this is because of the collapse of cattle prices during the pandemic, which led to an exodus of beef farmers, reducing production capacity and leading to constrained supply in the present. And that is a good opportunity to talk about market volatility and the importance of stable prices. Market volatility presents a risk to farmers where a year of bad prices may cause the loss of farmer livelihood to the point of exit. I recently found a good quotation from another report on the divergence of food commodity and consumer prices by Herb Vanden Doel, who argues, quote, "There are some who might argue that these issues, meaning the exit of farmers during price collapses, are self-correcting as producers leave farming. Thus, with decreasing numbers of farmers, the argument goes, the remaining farmers will have access to a larger share of the market. Another term for this process might be called consolidation, whereby large producers are created. Is this just the movement of the market or an undermining of millions of farmers?" End quotation. And I think this capsulates the point of this research. Farmers and consumers are being undermined by a food system that is highly volatile and serves neither farmers or consumers particularly well. But that leads us into possible causes of decreasing farmers' share of retail food prices. The NFU identified 4 contributing causes to decreasing farmers' share: loss of cooperative marketing institutions, a myopic focus of Canadian agriculture policy on export development, financialization, and corporate concentration. Canadian farmers once had access to a number of cooperative marketing institutions, including the Canadian Wheat Board, which operated as the single desk seller for all wheat and barley sold for export and human consumption, that ensured high quality products and good pricing for farmers, as well as single desk selling agencies for pork and very active dairy cooperatives. The tenets of market competition and free trade has oriented Canadian agriculture policy and economic thinking to be adverse to these institutions that once provided farmers with collective agency against the economic power of global commodity traders. These global commodity traders have also been empowered at the expense of farmers by Canada's export development policy for agricultural commodities. When competing on the world market in such vast quantities of agricultural goods, farmers are forced to become price takers and have farm gate prices driven downwards. And then we have financialization, which refers to the increasing influence of financial markets and actors in our food system, especially through the creation of speculative assets and non-material profits. Financialization has empowered multinational food commodity trading companies and has created market volatility, which is detrimental to farmer livelihood. And finally, we arrive at corporate concentration, which the previous three forces feed into and empower. This illustration, which many of you may recognize, represents the structure of the Canadian food system. So in key areas, there are choke points in particular sectors, notably for farm inputs, food processing, and retailing, where market structures are highly concentrated and where corporations hold outsized economic power. When there are few companies operating in an industry where the market structure is either oligopolistic or monopolistic, companies have the power to influence prices to both farmers and consumers. Examples include JBS and Cargill in the meatpacking industry, Bunge, Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, and Louis Dreyfus, which control over 80% of Canada's grain handling and was actually empowered by the allowance of mergers between Viterra and Bunge recently by the Canadian government. And then at retail, where the top four grocers in Canada handle 68% of retail grocery sales. This is where the NFU believes our research is important. Corporate power in the food system is something that is detrimental to Canadian consumers, and Canadian farmers. Extracting more value from the labor of farmers and the pocketbooks of consumers while providing less choice and delinking us from our food production systems. And this is the point of collaboration for both consumers and farmers to build something different from the existing corporate-dominated food system. And this is all just a teaser of the great work that the NFU has been able to do with the help of the Maison Foundation. I hope you all keep your eyes peeled for more from the NFU on this, including a formalized report on the farmer's share and economic well-being, as well as a number of proposed policy solutions, including the return of cooperative marketing institutions, strengthening Canada's supply management system, and confronting corporate concentration through public policy. But now I would like to welcome our panelists for this afternoon. Alyssa Gerhardt is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie University. She specializes in economic sociology, studying personal debt in Atlantic Canada using mixed method research. Alyssa has been involved in several different projects with the Rural Futures Research Center at Dalhousie, including a regional study on work, income, and community. Recently, she co-authored, Canada's Food Price Report in 2021, a national report that forecasts food prices and examines food trends. And even more recently, she helped to complete a study of farmers market food prices to better understand alternative food systems. Keldon Bester is the executive director of the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, or CAMP, and a fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI. Keldon has worked as a special advisor at the Competition Bureau, as a fellow at the Open Markets Institute, and as a consultant across sectors in Canada. And Alex Purdye is a research analyst and a master's student at Carleton University's Institute of Political Economy. His research focuses include monetary theory, currency internationalization, classical political economy, and the history of economic thought. I'll stop sharing my screen here and pin all of our great panelists. And myself. So for this panel, I'm going to do a round of individual questions, starting with Alyssa, and then I'll move into some group questions that you can all answer. So Alyssa, for you to start, you just finished working on a research project on food prices at farmers markets. I was wondering if you could describe what that project was and the types of questions you were hoping to answer in completing that project.
Sure, thank you. So I think just to set the stage for the work that we did through that project, we're living in a really unique moment right now, where there is a lot of public scrutiny on and interest in food prices. And I'm not saying that hasn't been the case in the past. I'm sure, there always has been interest because it does affect our daily lives. But there's this really unique conversation about greedflation that's been happening in the last number of years, and to what extent there is price gouging happening, and whether it's happening and to what extent it's happening of consumers. And so coupling this now with this real momentum to start buying Canadian made food products, that's driven by these geopolitical tensions and uncertainties that we're experiencing around tariffs and the trade war, potential trade war. So there is real peak understanding or interest in understanding the alternatives to this. For example, the role that alternative food systems can play here. So our project, which mainly took place in 2023 and early 2024, it was a mixed methods project, and we wanted to understand the pricing dynamics of farmers market vendors and their food products over a 5-year period, as well as the factors that go into the decision making around how they price their food. So to accomplish this, we conducted a survey of farmers market vendors across the country, and then we conducted a round of semi-structured interviews with a proportion of those survey participants. And we really wanted to see how these dynamics might be different in the alternative food system and the farmers market sector than compared to what we think is happening in the mainstream grocery retail sector. And I just want to stress that this is a pilot study that we conducted. It's exploratory. And what we found, aside from some of the results, which I think I'll get into shortly, is how badly price data infrastructure is needed in alternative food networks and in the farmers market sector. And this is something we hope to address in further iterations of this work. And hopefully I'll be able to touch on that later as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I am going to ask you about results, but specifically, I'm going to ask you about um, describing how farmers are making pricing decisions at farmers markets and what influences their price setting behaviors.
Yeah, so what we've found, particularly looking at the interviews that we had with the vendors, because you're able to really probe into those decision-making processes, um, is, similar to what we've heard in the grocery retail sector about why they're raising prices because of increased costs in the supply chain. Farmers also echoed that there's been significant increases in the price of their inputs. So, for example, things like seeds, labor. But rather than passing these costs down to consumers, the vendors that we interviewed were absorbing these costs themselves into their profit margins as best as they could, rather than so they were actually experiencing flatlining or declining profit margins compared to what we know is happening in the grocery retail sector. The mainstream grocery retail sector is that there's this boast of, record profits every quarter. So there was a big difference there. But I think there's this real, what we saw was there's this real embeddedness of farmers market vendors in their communities. There's a real accountability to their customers that came out in the interviews. And I think this comes from, both living and selling in these communities, having face-to-face interactions with customers, having relationships with customers. And in grocery retail, especially as it has evolved in the last decades, it's a little more impersonal in this aspect. The people that are making pricing decisions aren't necessarily having these personal interactions with consumers. Um, so what we saw was the farmers market vendors really cared about the communities that they're selling in and the issues that affect them. And I just want to share one of the quotes from the interviews that I think really exemplifies this. A participant said, "My husband and I have been involved in local food production for 20 years here in our area, and we're more concerned about food insecurity than we are about profit." And so I think this really exemplifies the care the relationship aspect with customers and sensitivity to the issues of the communities that we're not really observing with the corporate grocery retail market.
And can you speak to how, in your study, farmers markets balance that responsibility to community while maintaining a livelihood for themselves?
Yeah, so I mean, we did see, especially in the survey, the quantitative data we collected with their prices over a 5-year period. It's not to say that they aren't increasing their prices. There definitely were price increases, but there were interesting observations that I think, again, we can see some differences between this sector with the more mainstream grocery retail market. Farmers market vendors tended to raise their prices more so reflecting the cash-based nature of the sector. So you'd see smaller incremental increases by 25 cents, 50 cents, a dollar. But what we really noticed was that they rose their prices very infrequently. So again, I can only speak to our sample and not the general population. But when we looked at the 5-year period for the food products, some vendors never raised their prices on certain food products in those 5 years. And what we saw mainly happening was they were raising them, once or twice over the 5-year period. But again, this is very different than how the mainstream grocery retail market works. Those prices can fluctuate, every couple of days, weekly. I think that's normal practice. And again, just that, the vendors really thought about their customers when making these decisions and prioritize those relationships even at the expense of some of their profit margins.
And you've used the term alternative food systems or networks, and you use that in your study as well. I was wondering if you could expand on what that means, and how alternative food systems provide different opportunities for farmers outside of the retail sector, and whether or not they can act as alternatives or simply exist as parallels.
Mhm. Yeah, so basically, alternative food networks, it's bringing consumers and producers closer together. And so there are, a host of benefits associated with that. And just to touch on a few that we've gathered from the literature on alternative food networks, the benefits aren't just for the producers themselves, it's for the greater community. So things like the local economy, creating employment opportunities, regional self-sufficiency, more transparency between producers and customers, food security, resiliency of that food supply chain or that food supply chain. And I think generally, to answer your other question, what I would say currently about whether they exist as parallels or it's a viable alternative, I think currently they're more likely to exist as parallels, but with the right kind of policy advancements and infrastructure that could change. There is a potential to relocalize and regionalize more. But whether consumers and producers can always be in direct contact, I'm not sure if that's, feasible on a larger scale. And I'm not sure if it would ever really fully replace more of the mainstream retail sector. And I think it also depends on the scale of the operation and the type of product that they're selling. If it's a small scale operation, we have seen that some smaller scale producers with certain types of products have been able to viably exist and keep their business alive in these alternative food networks. So it is possible, just at what scale is not certain at this time.
The question of scale is always the big question
Yeah.
somehow. You talked about lack of data. I was wondering what data is missing. What data do you think would be helpful to future projects? I mean, the NFU's used farmers' share of retail prices, and that's not perfect. So, yeah, what data would be helpful for any further projects. And you mentioned this was just a pilot, and I was wondering if you could explain more about what you're hoping to do next with this study.
Yeah, so I think aside from just the data, it's the infrastructure to collect the data at regular intervals. One of the limitations of our study was it was a cross-sectional survey, so the vendors were reporting their prices at during one survey for having to recall prices over the last 5 years. I think part of creating this data infrastructure is being able to collect data at regular intervals from alternative food networks and sectors like the farmers markets. So I think that's one aim of future iteration. And so what we're working on right now is a grant application in which the NFU is actually a partner in this application, where we propose to create this data infrastructure, specifically starting with farmers markets and then, expanding potentially into other parts of alternative food networks, but starting with the farmers markets and being able to regularly collect data on food products, try in some way to standardize the price data that we're collecting, because that was another challenge with the different volumes of sale and some of the ambiguous volumes of sale that happen at farmers markets. So that's something we hope to address. And we're actually collaborating with the state of Vermont has a really robust program for reporting farmers market prices, and they've actually agreed a representative of theirs to come on as a collaborator, as well as partnering with Food Secure Canada and some other partners as well. So that's where we're hoping to take things in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Elisa, and certainly excited to be a partner on that project, and hopefully we get some good results out of that. Keldon, I'm gonna come to you next. To start, I was wondering if you could just talk about the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project and the kind of the work that your organization engages with.
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for having me today. So Camp is a think tank focused on monopoly issues in Canada, although they usually have implications for other countries as well, and I think the food system is a good example of that. So, what we do is conduct research, engage in commentary and advocate for policies that we feel respond to the issue of monopoly power, and so in the past. And as we'll discuss, we've done a lot of work related to the food system, related to sort of telecommunications, big tech, airlines, private equity. Clearly, we have a bit of a focus problem. But in Canada, the monopoly problem is pretty widespread, and so there's no shortage of work. So that's a bit of a summary of the work that we do. One big thing in the past has been advocating for reform of Canada's competition law, which is one part of this puzzle. But the monopoly problem goes much wider than that, and so we it's good that we're having this conversation sort of outside the confines of the usual competition policy conversation.
And you mentioned your work on the food system, and Camp has recently, well, somewhat recently, published a study called From Plow to Pantry about concentration in the Canadian food system. I was wondering if you could talk about that report a bit and what your findings were.
Yeah, I'm always wondering when I have to stop calling something a new report, and I think it's when when we publish another one. So Plow to Pantry came out last fall, and really that was a survey of both concentration levels and competition issues throughout the food system. And the motivation for that report was we saw a very important conversation that we've been talking about today, which was food prices and sort of what consumers were encountering at the grocery aisle. But we knew from even just our sort of initial work and our experience both in Canada and with international peers is that the problem is runs much deeper than just the grocery shelf. And I like the funnel diagram that you showed earlier. I often talk about sort of the V of concentration with farmers stuck between, two very highly concentrated sides of their business. But we wanted to put together a bit of a survey that brought together the data that we had on hand about all the different markets that impact what consumers are seeing on the shelves. So, shock of shocks, and we've already talked about it a little bit, the markets that farmers interact with and that consumers interact with are highly concentrated, and that the further up the chain you go, the more intense the concentration gets, to a level that is, I think, frankly shocking to most folks if they have the time to think about it. So suppliers and commodity traders being probably the biggest example. And so what we wanted to do is provide a scan, if you will, that we plan to sort of drill into different parts of the supply chain going forward. But ultimately, the real goal was to say, yes, we have a concentration problem at the retail side, but this is just one layer of this issue.
And one of the things I appreciated about that report, and this is going to sound a little nerdy, was the appendix where you provide a really great list of the history of major mergers between food and ag companies in Canada. And I was wondering if you could just say quickly, because there were many mergers in that list, how did we get to this state of concentration in Canada?
I'll just quickly recite them all from memory. In so many words, how we got there is um, intensifying in the 80s, but not limited to the 80s. Canada really took an approach that said, competition is nice, but we're going to trade that off for things that we think are worthwhile as well. And in general, that fell under this big umbrella term of efficiencies, which would include economies of scale, which would include layoffs, things like that. And what that meant was our merger law, that is the law that dictated our approach to mergers and acquisitions, as kind of enforced by the Competition Bureau, which is our competition cop, if you will, in Canada. It meant that the bar for blocking a merger, basically saying no, was extremely high, and that we would favor approaches that allowed mergers to go through, but sort of sanded off the rough edges of transactions while still allowing them to go through. So again, one of the few of the brave people who actually read through the appendix, what you'll notice is a clear trend of allowing mergers to go through. The Bureau really hasn't intervened in a material way. Bungie Viterra, they took a stronger stance against the merger, although in that case it was the Minister of Transport who had the ultimate decision, and they allowed it to go through with some conditions. So all that, to wrap it up in one sentence, if we say how did we get here, it's that we thought we had a bargain that said if we allowed for consolidation, we would see benefits on the other side of that. And 40 odd years later, we're looking back and we're saying, I really do miss that competition if we ever had it. And going in reverse is much more difficult than going forward.
And you preempted my my question when talking about that bargain. Can you talk about how monopoly and oligopoly market structures affect how both farmers and consumers are made to absorb costs of concentrated industries, and we don't see that benefit that you've talked about?
Yeah, and that phrase "absorb cost" is an interesting one. And if we go back to that quote, or the quotes about, there are many factors influencing the cost of food. And I mean, that's undoubtedly true. But what competition, or, the lack thereof, determines, along with public policy, is who bears the brunt of that. And so, in Canada, something everybody else is familiar with is, consumers bore, bore the brunt of cost increases, while retailers were either able to keep their margins flat, which means their absolute profit numbers went up, or they were able to expand their margins. And contrast that with in the UK, where in sort of the years of heavier inflation, they've got a much more competitive retail grocery market. And to put it in one way, retailers had to share the burden with consumers because that competition competed away that margin that they would have otherwise preferred to keep. And we see that, recently, if you look at some UK headlines, grocers are warning their investors saying, we're engaged in a pretty serious price war. We're going to be dedicating, serious resources to discounts and to programs to keep customers coming back. That question of, who ultimately bears the cost, and we're having that discussion now, related to tariffs and how those fall, who those fall on, and how they fall on folks. It is a question of the competition at different points along the supply chain, where I think as you've shown, farmers really have no power to, they are price takers fundamentally, and their ability to pass on those rising costs is extremely limited. And the same goes for consumers when we don't have options. Who really benefits? Well, yes, the retailers in this case, but when Galen appeared in front of Parliament, he said, we're just one part of this problem, and he was right to say so, because if we look further up the chain, there are people that everyday Canadians who are busy and don't need to know who JBS is. These companies are doing quite well and have largely been left out of the analysis, I think.
I would agree with that, absolutely. But you talked about tariffs, and trade has been somewhat of a hot topic recently, pardon my sarcasm. Um, but when we talk about trade, we think of trade as happening between national or state governments. But with the rise of global commodity traders, that sort of ceases to be the case in many ways. When talking about the food system and farmer economic well-being, how does corporate concentration affect both food prices and farmer outcomes through trade and globalization?
It's funny. There's sort of the policy conversation often is this: well, who do we have a trade agreement with, and who do we have, who's part of the TPP or what have you. But I think sort of the opposite is true. And one thing we're seeing is trade really is the relationship businesses to businesses, on a fairly like micro level, although it's impacted by these macro factors. And so when you think about farmers, and I hesitate to speak for them, so I want to, rely on surveys and what we hear. They see corporate concentration as, especially in certain markets, highly detrimental to their business, whether it's and as we included some survey data from the good folks at Real Agriculture, that was farming machinery, farming retail, fertilizer, chemicals, seeds. When you ask people, have you benefited from the consolidation and increased concentration that has occurred over the past couple of decades? The answer is almost certainly is frequently no, or at best, I'm not sure, or it's had sort of no effect. So on the trade side, I'm less familiar with it, and so that's just an area, other than the concept of you know the bigger the role of global commodity traders, the more it becomes maybe closer to what you're describing, which is not necessarily business to business transactions, but individual farmers, who are interacting with organizations that are probably, for practical purposes, national economies unto themselves. Like Glencore probably has as much sway or more sway in the food system than sort of the average country, which is not the most exciting or encouraging thing to think about. But when I think about what effect this has on farmers' livelihoods, I just ask them, and they'll generally tell you, and they're fairly pragmatic folks about it.
When we talk about corporate concentration, generally we talk about economic power, and that's what this conversation's been about mostly. But you recently co-wrote an article with Jennifer Clapp that touched on the political components of power that comes along with this economic power that large agri-food companies hold. What political power do these companies wield, and to what effect?
And I think Jennifer is in the audience, so my ability to totally misrepresent our article is limited. Corporate concentration is a bit like gravity, right? Like a planet gets big enough, and it shapes the world around it, and whether they are kind of like a good company or a bad company, quote unquote. Although I think post February 22 and post, you know, or in the midst of the second Trump administration, we're finding out that most companies are just companies. The monopoly conversation can very often be boiled down into dollars and cents and high prices, low prices. Sometimes we talk about innovation, but we really are talking about sort of the health of the market and the health of the people that interact with that market, and I mean that in sort of not a physical way. So when we think about the health of our political system, we understand that we as a democracy have created systems and checks and balances to distribute different kinds of power, political power, economic power, and competition policy in general is an important part of that, because while it has this economic focus, it comes from this understanding that if you allow firms to become too dominant, they begin to shape the world around them. And so the political side of that and the ability to shape regulation, to delay regulation, and to shift decisions, whether it's funding or contracts, in their favor is I think a simultaneously like a well-known topic, and something that there's a lot of effort and research into, but what I think has been missing for sort of the not so recent history is again this monopoly angle, and what is an enabler of that political power, that is a bit downstream from economic power.
Excellent. Thank you, Keldon. Alex, thank you for your patience. I'm coming to you now. I really enjoyed reading the report that you wrote for the Broadbent Institute, which you all can find on the Broadbent Institute website, called Canadian Grocery Profitability, Inflation, Wages, and Financialization. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the work you did for that report.
Yeah, absolutely. So the report for the Institute was basically an analysis of the grocery retail market from the mid 2010s to the like immediate post-pandemic. And the main kind of driver was everyone was talking about grocery inflation from the consumer perspective. And what was really getting lost there was the impacts on labor. Uh, so what I wanted to look at is how was labor impacted and how can we generate some solutions to protect labor in situations like that kind of sudden price increase and relative real wage decline that happened. So like the first thing was in the mid 2010s, grocery workers actually won really substantial wage increases through collective bargaining. It was, and this was kind of met with not price increases, but a decline in profit margins from major grocery retailers. And this was great. And it also sparked kind of a wave of labor saving innovations in the grocery retail market. Particularly, there was some pretty heavy investment looking into automated driving for supply chains, which, you know, I'm mixed about. Um, but this trend like immediately reversed in the pandemic period. There was this major supply shock. Uh, there were geopolitical situations happening, there were supply chain bottlenecks, and we saw generalized inflation, but also specifically significant grocery inflation. And this kind of inflation that happened was like people call it greedflation. Seller's inflation is generally the more like technical term, but it was this growth in grocery prices that was met with profit margin increases and real relative wage declines that kind of wiped out all of the wins that grocery store workers had in the late mid 2010s. And the final kind of component of this was trying to look at how they got away with these price increases, which I think is kind of twofold. On the one hand, corporate concentration was definitely a component of this. Like market power and the ability to set prices was certainly there. But at the same time, the other thing I was looking at was kind of how do financial markets work in situations where you have a decline in profitability immediately preceding the opportunity for a price shock. And I think you're asking me more about the financialization component later, so I can speak to that more at length. But essentially, I was identifying financialization as a factor in driving these price increases and profit margin increases. So we kind of looked for recommendations there because, you want to find solutions, you want to be solutions oriented. And we ended up looking at three kind of solutions. First, the standard that was widely talked about at the time, windfall profit taxes, where when you have these major increases in profit, you have essentially emergency taxation that works to kind of penalize that immediate gain that comes at the expense of consumers and workers, which would have been a wonderful policy and can kind of offset the pursuit of that behavior later. Uh, the second was specifically in terms of trying to protect labor, making sector-based bargaining easier. So kind of expanding the capacity of unions to generalize their power and the kind of power of grocery retail workers as a cohesive group, which would let them, in situations where their real wages suddenly decline like that, have significant advantages going into their next bargaining round, and they can look to recover those losses that the workers made. And finally, this one was more controversial, but emergency price controls, where you have sudden situations where these major increases happen in price and we're seeing immense negative impacts on consumers and workers. You can implement price controls as a temporary measure in order to kind of let things cool off a bit as you adjust. Obviously, there are major market impacts for this, and it was one of the recommendations I was more mixed on. But yeah, those were the three in the proposal, though there was also something I wanted to include, but ended up not because it was very novel at the time. But it's become less so recently, and that's public option grocery stores. In Chicago at the time, there was this initiative going on. There was a lot of discussion around it, which I was shocked by because it's the states of all places. Um, but for municipally owned grocery stores as both a way to address these rapid price shocks as well as address the issue of food deserts. And that, I think, is a very comprehensive solution for how you can kind of directly intervene in the market and try and regulate wages in particular, but prices as well through these kind of these firms that don't need to run at a profit, that can get tax breaks and have this kind of flexibility. Um, and it's been great seeing that become a more talked about solution. Zohran Mamdani, who's running for mayor or planning on running for mayor as the Democratic candidate in New York City, has really been pushing this as a major flagship policy to address issues of food accessibility in terms of both price and actual like physical food deserts there. So if I were to rewrite this, because this was a few years ago, I would definitely include that as a policy solution.
Well, apart from your great comments, I'm extra glad that you've been able to join the webinar. Otherwise, I wouldn't have be able to hear about this extra solution. Really cool. Um, I tried to define financialization in my presentation. It's a core idea that you use in yours. I was wondering, how do you best explain financialization to people who don't study the issue, and what impact does it have on our food system?
Yeah, that's a great question, albeit a hard one. Um, so there's kind of this dominant conception of financialization, which is the one you brought up, where it's the expansion of kind of the industry through the growth of derivative markets, and in the past several years, through the expansion of kind of repos and things that create a lot of market volatility, as well as kind of short run pushes that seek to kind of hollow out industry and extract as much as they can while destroying firms. And that's definitely a thing. Like, I'm not going to deny that. We just need to look at companies like Boeing to see what happens there. But at the same time, I want to look at this kind of older conception of financialization, and that's how it works as a kind of market coordinating mechanism that facilitates competition, not just within industries, but also between industries. So the whole idea here is basically that the more liquid a firm is, the more able it is to rapidly adjust to changing market conditions and extract money. So financial institutions are the most competitive firms in the entire market because they can rapidly shift, they have no fixed capital, and it's just a super easy way to make money. Um, but the kind of impact that this has is there's a regulation between industries on how much profit you need to make. Like you need to maintain a certain level of profitability to attract investment, and this investment needs to continually go towards innovations that you can continue to reduce your cost structure. And it's kind of this alternative conception of competition that integrates the role of finance. And within this, something we saw was that in the late 2010s, this kind of manifested as the grocery industry was relatively stagnant. Because of these wage increases, their profitability had declined, which caused a like internal investment, but not a lot of external investment and growth in the equity markets for this kind of innovation pushing forward because they were trying to recapture lost profitability. Um, and that is one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to kind of drive down wages. Like in order to recapture this profitability, you have to have, in order to continue to attract sufficient investment, because otherwise financial firms will just go to other industries. And as this kind of progressed into the pandemic period, with the price shocks, the geopolitical situation in Ukraine, the issues of climate change, like everything that was mentioned earlier, as well as concentration, they were able to increase prices instead of continuing this line of innovation as a way of passing costs on to consumers, as well as to drop real wages. So it's this kind of constant tension with financialization to continually hit this rate of profit you need to hit in order to function through competition between industries.
And I want to talk more about competition. I mean, it's a fascinating idea in traditional economic thought, which is your area, one of your areas of expertise. And so I would generally I see competition as talked about as a positive trait or a positive thing in our economy and society, and is seen as a solution for issues in our food system. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the alternative views of competition that you explore in your report, um, and whether or not increased competition is a real solution for the issues we
Yeah,
face in our food system.
yeah, totally. Um, so Generally speaking, the way competition is talked about is in a quantitative sense, right? The more dispersed, the more number of firms, the less centralized firms are, the more competition there is, which allows for firms and workers to kind of reap benefits, and it limits the market power of firms. Now, there is certainly a strong case there, and I agree with a lot of that, particularly as it comes to price setting ability and market power. But at the same time, um, we can kind of think about competition as this kind of agility of firms themselves and the ability to adapt and constantly shift around resources so that they can expand economies of scale, so they can create more productive methods, so that they can undercut competition and kind of expand outwards. And a large part of this process, and I'm going to focus on this from a kind of labor capital end, is that that you need to drive down wages to do this, and you need to kind of increase productivity to do this. And as a component of that, what you kind of see is sorry, I'm trying to think of how to describe this. Um, so actually, I'm going to change gears real quick. So what you kind of see in terms of the labor angle is market power is definitely a component of this in terms of the ability to force workers to be price takers. But at the same time, I think this quantitative conception of competition kind of ends up individualizing the perspective of how wages are determined and workers kind of operate. And I want us to kind of look back and reintegrate the political component of economics that's been kind of slipping away over the past 100 years. And I want us to kind of consider that wage increases don't happen through decentralization and market conditions. What they really kind of stem from is is the political power of workers and their ability to organize. We saw that in the grocery industry in the 2010s. It wasn't a deconcentration of the grocery industry that led to wage increases. It was collective bargaining and pushes from organized labor that managed to win these gains. And when these gains are won, it can spur innovation, as I've previously said, um, which is a great thing as firms are kind of forced to adapt to these new conditions. And I think that's really the central thing when it comes to competition from a labor perspective, is that it's a political phenomenon. It's not just a market phenomenon.
I really appreciate that answer, Alex. It's true that we've sort of lost the political piece of political economy in that thinking, and it's just become economics. Looking at the time, I'm going to shift into answers or questions for the panel to answer. And my first question is, you've all shown different aspects of the Canadian food system and different ways that food price inflation has impacted different people or different mechanisms through which this has come about. People have talked about the overwhelmingly complex nature of the issue in trying to pin down the real causes. And people have said in this meta review that I read from scholars at the University of Guelph in Ottawa, they said that the lack of consensus in explaining food price inflation was due to the complicated and globalized nature of our food system. I was wondering if you all could provide a brief answer on whether or not you think that statement is true and to what extent that statement is true.
Are we going in a specific order?
Anybody can go. Anybody can go. That's fine.
Yeah, just to speak on that paper, I thought it was really illuminating because it highlighted that there's very few voices that are actually dictating and informing public and policymakers' perceptions of food prices. And personally, I think that there's certain groups that benefit from making food price inflation seem overly complicated. I not arguing that it's not complex, but maybe it isn't as complicated as it's made to seem. So if anything, I think that paper really showed the need for more voices in this area contributing to these discussions.
I, there's a funny phrase an old professor had, is like, you can't take refuge in complexity. Even if problems are complex, even if they are multidimensional, we need to, spend the time to pick them apart. And there's something I don't really have a good phrasing for it, but sometimes we can get in these situations where we say, well, if this isn't the solution to the whole problem, then why are we pursuing it? And I think that's, pretty short-sighted, or it ends up being fairly short-sighted because, as we've seen in this conversation, and I think Alex's questions in particular show that, there's different ways to attack the problem, and there's nothing excluding walking down multiple paths at once. So it's certainly a multi-factor problem or concept. What determines the price of food? But that's not to suggest that some of those levers, and probably more levers than we think, are not within our control. Especially in Canada, a country that has both a past and present, where we do make decisions that other countries have just said, well, this is the market, we can't do anything about it, and have throughout our history. So again, we really can't take refuge in complexity, and just because we're not solving the entire problem doesn't mean there isn't fruits to be gained through these different paths.
I would agree with all that. Yeah. Like, I think this kind of retreat into complexity is certainly a thing. It's used to kind of obscure what's going on and viable alternatives to how we can run not just our food system, but our economy. But one thing I would kind of add into this is that economics as a discipline is not a pure science. It's not like physics. It's ideological, it's political. There are interests at play, and there are people that have differing conceptions of how they want the economy to be run, who gets what, and how they get it. So I think kind of centering that as why do we want to make this as complex as possible? We want to there are people that want to obscure the viability of a different world and a better world.
I think you're right again, Alex. I appreciate that very much. And again, in the interest of time, I'll ask you all just one more question, even though I have a list of questions I could ask you. If we're talking about different worlds and policy solutions as a addition to that, what do you all see as potential policy solutions that would be beneficial to both farmers and consumers in tackling issues of food price, affordability, and economic dignity for farmers?
I guess
I,
I'll go first.
oh, sorry.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh, no, you go ahead, Keldon. Okay. Um, so I'm just going to speak to what came out of the interviews with the farmers market vendors, because they had ideas of different policy solutions, and there were some overarching ones that were, really evident from the interviews. So the three overarching policy solutions that came out from that work is, the first was more or strengthened farmers market coupon programs. So these type of programs would benefit both producers, but also could improve food security outcomes for the community and more vulnerable communities. The second was greater investment in infrastructure like food hubs that connect farmers with institutional buyers, and they provide more centralized processing and distribution for small scale producers, and supports this kind of infrastructure that would ease the burden of the processing and distribution for the more small scale producers. And then the third policy solution that came out was to reduce the burden of government regulations on small businesses by creating scale appropriate regulations. So ensuring that there's regulatory fairness by a more formal recognition of the differences in scale between, the small producers and those involved in more of the industrial scale food and agricultural production, and then to develop regulations accordingly that fit those scales.
If I had sort of two big ideas for it, it's looking further up that chain at where industries have seriously consolidated, and where possible, and the definition of possible really depends on who you're asking. We need to deconcentrate. We need to break up kind of the fake economies of scale that do exist in these businesses, and while respecting the the legitimate ones, and frankly, where you can't deconcentrate or where you choose not to, or where the cost would be too great, you really need to enforce fair competition. And there's a couple of definitions for that, or elements of the definition, but one that I think is the most relevant here is, avoiding competition that is really just the exercise of power, of accumulated power, which I think, farmers are very familiar with, one-way contracts, kind of take it or leave it terms, things like that. So deconcentrate, and where you can't, I think really fleshing out a definition of fair competition and dedicating resources to enforce it is most likely to benefit farmers.
I think I've already kind of spoken to the solutions that came out of the recommendations that came out of the report I wrote. So in recognition of time, I think I'll just not speak.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Alex. I appreciate that too. Thank you, all three of you, very much for serving as panelists on this webinar. I've really appreciated reading your work or working with you in some cases on some of these. And you've all added some very important components to this conversation. So thank you again.